I've been a barista at the same Starbucks in downtown Chicago for nearly 5 years. The place is my second home. I know the regulars, the rhythms, and the hum of the espresso machines as intimately as my own heartbeat. One autumn morning, as the coffee shop buzzed with its usual chatter and the comforting aroma of roasted beans, something happened that would shatter my sense of normalcy and haunt me for months to come. Sarah was one of our regulars. She had this magnetic charm, always smiling, always friendly, and always with her caramel macchiato in hand. On that crisp October day, she came in as usual, greeted us with her bright, easygoing demeanor, and settled into her favorite corner table. The leaves outside were ablaze with fall colors. The world seemed perfect. The morning rush was in full swing, but amidst the chaos, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Sarah sat there, typing away on her laptop, her usual contentment radiating outward. I served her the macchiato she loved so much, and as I handed it to her, she flashed that warm smile. I returned to the counter, our brief exchange already fading into the background of my day. Around 10 o'clock, the atmosphere in the shop shifted. It was subtle at first, a slight chill, a murmur of unease. I noticed Sarah's laptop still open, her half-finished macchiato gone cold. Her phone was on the table, her bag hanging on the back of her chair. Everything seemed untouched, as if she had stepped away for just a moment. But as minutes ticked by and she didn't return, the murmur of concern began to grow. I remember the exact moment when I realized something was seriously wrong. The shop was quieter now, the patrons glancing at Sarah's table with a mix of curiosity and anxiety. My colleague Janet went over to check if Sarah needed anything, but she returned with a bewildered expression, saying Sarah was nowhere in sight. It was as if she had evaporated into thin air. We searched the shop, checked the restrooms, and even peeked outside, hoping to find her. No luck. Her friends started arriving, their faces etched with worry. The police were called, and the usual routine of filing a missing persons report commenced. The place felt heavy, like a shroud of tension had descended upon it. Security footage was the next step. I watched the replay on a small monitor behind the counter. Sarah's movements were clear, entering the shop, ordering her drink, setting up at her table. But then the footage turned blank. No sign of her leaving. It was as if she had vanished from the camera's view. The eerie realization that there was no footage of her exiting the store gnawed at me. Days became weeks, and weeks bled into months. Despite the diligent efforts of the police, no leads emerged. The season turned from autumn to winter, and with it, the once vibrant shop now carried an air of perpetual unease. The mystery of Sarah's disappearance was a constant whisper among the staff and patrons. Rumors began to swirl. Some whispered about a hidden door behind a bookshelf, a secret passage that no one had ever noticed before. Others speculated about Sarah having witnessed something she shouldn't have, something dark and sinister that led to her disappearance. The stories grew wilder with each retelling, but none could explain the chilling truth. Every creak of the floorboards, every flicker of the lights in that Starbucks now sends shivers down my spine. I find myself constantly checking the security footage, as if expecting to see Sarah's face appear once more. But it's always the same. A record of her arrival and a void where she should have been. Sarah's case remains one of Chicago's most baffling mysteries, a haunting reminder of how the ordinary can become extraordinary in the blink of an eye. The coffee shop continues to serve its regulars, but the once comforting aroma of brewed coffee now carries an undercurrent of dread. No matter how normal the day may seem, the memory of Sarah's sudden disappearance reminds us that darkness can lurk even in the most familiar places. Los Angeles is a city where the dreams and nightmares coexist under the relentless sun. On that particular afternoon, it felt like any other day at the local Starbucks, a sanctuary for me, David, a struggling screenwriter clinging to the hope of writing the next great screenplay. My iced latte sat on the table, a small oasis in a sea of chaotic energy. The familiar hum of the espresso machine and the murmur of conversations usually provided a comforting background for my scribblings. But that day was different. It started subtly, a prickling sensation at the back of my neck. I was engrossed in my notes when the feeling of being watched began to gnaw at me. I looked up, half expecting to find someone simply observing my creative process. Instead, I met the gaze of a man seated across from me. He was draped in a dark, hooded sweatshirt, his face mostly obscured by the shadows of his hood. But his eyes were unsettling. They were cold, calculating, and seemed to pierce through the veil of normalcy that enveloped the coffee shop. I tried to convince myself it was my imagination, a figment of stress or fatigue, but the intensity of his stare was undeniable. I returned to my notebook, but the distraction was unbearable. Every time I looked up, his gaze was still locked onto me, as if he was not just watching, but waiting for something. The air around me seemed to thicken with tension, each sip of my latte turning into a gulp of anxiety. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours. I could no longer focus on the story I was trying to create. The once soothing buzz of the cafe had turned into a cacophony of whispers, every sound amplified by the dread coiling inside me. My heart raced as I tried to ignore the piercing eyes. Each time our eyes met, a shiver ran down my spine, leaving me feeling increasingly exposed and vulnerable. Unable to endure it any longer, I gathered my things, my hands trembling as I packed my notebook and pen. The stranger's eyes never left me. I felt his gaze like a weight on my shoulders, making every movement feel heavy, every second an eternity. I quickened my pace, almost running toward the exit, desperate to escape the oppressive atmosphere. As I stepped outside, the fresh air hit me like a wave of relief. I glanced back at the Starbucks, half expecting to see him following me. But he was nowhere to be seen. I shook off the feeling, telling myself it was just paranoia, a trick of the mind. Yet the sense of unease lingered. It followed me, an invisible shadow, as I walked home through the dimly lit streets of Los Angeles. The city that had once seemed vibrant and full of potential now felt ominous and threatening. My footsteps echoed in the quiet night, mingling with the distant hum of traffic. As I turned onto my street, I felt it, a familiar prickling sensation at the back of my neck. I glanced over my shoulder, and there he was, the same dark figure from Starbucks, his hood pulled low, his presence unmistakable. The sight of him sent a jolt of fear through me. My heart pounded as I quickened my pace, glancing back to see him maintaining the same distance behind me. It was as if he had been waiting for this moment. I began to run, the rhythmic pounding of my footsteps, now accompanied by the relentless sound of his pursuit. The streetlights flickered, casting eerie shadows that danced alongside me. Panic surged through me, my breaths coming in ragged gasps. I tried to lose him by zigzagging through the streets, but his shadow remained a constant, ominous presence. I reached my apartment building, fumbling with my keys as I desperately tried to unlock the door. My hands shook, my mind racing with thoughts of what might happen if I failed to escape. As the door creaked open, I glanced back once more, but the figure had vanished. I slammed the door behind me, locking it with trembling fingers. I leaned against it, my heart still racing, the room spinning with the adrenaline of the chase. I tried to rationalize the experience, telling myself it was just a coincidence, a case of mistaken identity. But the next day, as I walked past the Starbucks, I couldn't shake the feeling that he was still out there, somewhere, watching me. The comfort of the familiar cafe was forever tainted by that chilling encounter. I knew deep down that the stranger's gaze was more than just a fleeting moment of discomfort. It was a haunting reminder that sometimes the shadows lurking in the sunlight are the most terrifying of all. I never believed in ghosts until I started working at the Starbucks on Elm Street. It was a small-town gig, one of those places where everyone knows everyone, and the most scandalous thing is a bad Yelp review. But that all changed when I became the latest victim of the place's growing reputation. It all started innocently enough. The first night, I was assigned the closing shift. The store was quiet, the kind of peaceful quiet that only comes after the caffeine rush of the day has subsided. I was just finishing up the last of the cleaning when the temperature dropped suddenly. I brushed it off as an overactive air conditioning system. But then I caught a whiff of freshly brewed coffee. Odd, because the store had been closed for hours. I told myself it was my imagination, fueled by too many late-night shifts. That was until the first cup fell. One moment it was perched on the counter. The next, it shattered on the floor, the pieces scattering like a chaotic constellation. I sighed and cleaned up the mess, convincing myself it was just an accident. But things only got stranger. The espresso machine started acting up. It was a clunky old beast, known for its quirks, but this was different. In the dead of night, it roared to life, grinding beans and hissing as though it were preparing for battle. It would sometimes go silent, as suddenly as it had started, leaving an eerie quiet in its wake. The others had warned me, but I'd written off their stories as overblown. Emily, one of the more experienced baristas, had mentioned feeling an icy breath on her neck, hearing whispers of her name. She described seeing a translucent man in a long coat, his face hidden in shadow. I laughed it off, assuming she was just spooked by the long hours. That was until I experienced it myself. It was a night like any other. I was alone in the store, finishing up the closing procedures. The lights flickered erratically, casting long, menacing shadows on the walls. I shook my head, chalking it up to faulty wiring or my fatigue playing tricks on me. As I was mopping the floor, a sudden gust of cold air swept through the store. I felt an icy breath on the back of my neck, sending shivers down my spine. My heart pounded as I spun around, expecting to find the air conditioning on high or a draft from an open window. Instead, I was met with a sight that froze me to my core. A ghostly figure stood at the end of the aisle. The figure was translucent, barely more than a shadow, but the outline of a man in a long coat was unmistakable. His features were obscured, but the malevolent aura he radiated was palpable. My breath caught in my throat as he seemed to reach out toward me, his hand extending slowly. I wanted to scream, to run, but my feet felt rooted to the floor. The figure's eyes, dark and hollow, seemed to pierce through me. The temperature dropped further, the air growing heavy with a presence I couldn't comprehend. My instincts screamed at me to get out. Without thinking, I bolted for the exit. I nearly tripped over the mop bucket as I fled, slamming the door behind me. My heart raced as I stumbled to my car. The sight of the ghostly figure seared into my mind. I knew that something wasn't right. The next day I returned to work, but the fear still gripped me. I wasn't the only one who had witnessed the strange occurrences. Others had reported similar experiences: caffeine cups falling off shelves, whispers in the dark, and the unsettling feeling of being watched. The legend of the haunted Starbucks spread like wildfire. paranormal investigators began to flock to the store, armed with cameras and ghost hunting equipment. They captured unexplained phenomena on film, but the true nature of the hauntings remained elusive. Despite the stories and the fear, the coffee shop remained open. We baristas continued to serve coffee with forced smiles, hoping that one day the spirits would find peace and leave us in tranquility. Until then, the haunted Starbucks stood as a blend of the supernatural and the everyday, a place where the unknown brewed alongside the aroma of freshly ground coffee. And every time I close up at night, I can't shake the feeling that I'm not alone. The shadows seem to watch me, and the whispers in the air grow louder. I don't know if the ghostly figure is still there, but I do know one thing. Some mysteries are better left unsolved.